The Force binds all things across the galaxy, connecting every living being in an invisible web. But webs can be cut, rewoven, and sometimes, if something impossible enough reaches through, rethreaded entirely. No hyperspace signature registered. No astrogation chart accounted for it. One moment the skies above Naboo held only the calm violet dusk of a planet at peace. The next, a tear opened in the fabric of the sky itself, silent and absolute, and a starship the length of a small city slid out of nowhere into orbit. It did not look like anything the galaxy had built. Its hull was pale and segmented, not Durasteel gray, but a warm off-white, curved where Republic cruisers were angular, elegant where Separatist designs were brutal. A saucer-shaped primary hull rode above twin nacelles that pulsed with a soft blue, light unlike any ion. Drive in the Holonet archives. Along its flank, painted letters that meant nothing to anyone in this galaxy. NCC 1701K, USS Enterprise. Inside, 6 people who did not belong. In this year stood on a bridge that did not belong in this galaxy, and tried to process the fact that they were all, technically, dead or would be. In about 11 years, on a different day, in a war none of them had fought yet because it hadn't happened. Ahsoka Tano was the first to speak, mostly because she was the only one who didn't have to reconcile a face she recognized. "Okay," she said, voice tight. "Does anyone else remember dying? Or was that just me? I remember a Sith Lord's blade, and then nothing." Obi-Wan Kenobi said quietly, one hand braced against a console that hummed with unfamiliar power. Beside him, Qui-Gon Jinn, impossibly, since Obi-Wan had watched him die on Naboo years ago in a memory that no longer matched the dates on the ship's chronometer, looked less startled than the rest of them, as though some part of him had learned, across 2 lifetimes, not to be surprised by the Force's sense of humor. Anakin Skywalker said nothing. He was staring at his own hands, flesh and Durasteel both, and then at the reflection thrown back at him by a darkened viewport. And something in his jaw had gone very still. Padmé Amidala, Queen of Naboo in a body that had not yet been elected to that office in this timeline, folded her hands in front of her, the way she did when she needed the gesture to hold her together. Beside her, Duchess Satine. Cries of Mandalore wore the expression of a diplomat cataloging every exit in a room before deciding whether to trust anyone in it. Then the air in the center of the bridge folded in on itself, and a man appeared out of nothing, wearing what might generously be called a Starfleet uniform if Starfleet uniforms came in shades of self-satisfied smugness. "Oh, don't look so grim," Hugh said, spreading his hands. "You're not dead. Well, you were. Past tense. Very past tense, actually, given where I've put you." He glanced around the bridge with the air of a man inspecting a restaurant he owned but rarely visited. "This is the Enterprise, NCC 1701K, on loan from a rather more agreeable century than the one you're used to. Try not to break it." "Who?" said Obi-Wan, with the particular calm of a Jedi restraining the urge to reach for a weapon. "Are you?" "I'm Q, capital Q. If you want to be formal about it, which you don't, because it won't help." He snapped his fingers, and the view screen shifted to show Naboo's surface below, peaceful, sunlit, utterly unaware. 1 year before your trade. Federation throws a tantrum over taxation and a Sith Lord. You've never heard of starts the clock on everything. That happens to you afterward. I've pulled you out of the mess you eventually made of things and dropped you here, before most of it happened. Because, and I want to be honest, I got bored watching you solve every problem by setting something on fire. Ahsoka's montrals twitched. "You're saying we're in the past. Our past. I'm saying you're in your past, yes. Well done. You've been paying attention." Hugh's gaze slid to Anakin, lingering a beat too long. "Your past especially. Though I'd recommend you not go looking for yourself just yet. Paradoxes are messy, and I do have to clean them up personally, which is tedious." "And the crew?" Padmé asked, nodding to the officers at the surrounding stations, men and women in unfamiliar uniforms who had, remarkably, not panicked once during this entire exchange, which told her more about their training than anything Q had said. "Are they aware of what's happening?" Captains briefed. Crews briefed. "Everyone's delightfully professional about the whole thing," Q said. "I find humans tolerable in small, disciplined doses. This is a disciplined dose." Qui-Gon studied Q with the unreadable Patience of a man who had spent a second lifetime learning to recognize power that didn't answer to the Force. Why us? Why now? Q's smile thinned. Just slightly, the first honest thing he'd shown since arriving. Because I watched what you became without this chance. And I found the story unsatisfying. Call it curiosity. Call it a gift, if you want to feel grateful. I'd suggest you use it before I get bored again. The bridge was silent a moment. Below them, Naboo turned in the light. A year of peace still intact, a war still unwritten. And 6 people who remembered exactly how it had all gone wrong once already stood ready to decide whether the second draft would be any better. Q's idea of a short version turned out to be relative. He conjured a chair out of nothing, spun it once for effect, and sat facing the group with the air of a lecturer who found his own subject far more entertaining than his students did. Right? Abbreviated history. Because I know none of you have the patience for the director's cut. And frankly, neither do I. He raised a hand, and the view screen behind him dissolved into images, not holograms exactly. Something smoother, more total, as though the screen had simply stopped being a screen and become a window onto other days. Ahsoka watched her own face flicker past at 14, at 17, at an age she hadn't lived to yet in this rewound year, and felt something cold settle behind her montrals. Your republic, Q said, spends the next decade or so pretending a trade dispute over Naboo is the worst thing that's going to happen to it. It isn't. It's the opening move. The image shifted. A red-cloaked figure in shadow, a Senate chamber, a face none of them recognized because he had spent 30 years making sure no one would. There is a Sith Lord sitting in your Senate right now, under a name you all know and trust, and he has been building toward total power since before any of you were old enough to hold a lightsaber. He starts a war he also secretly commands both sides of. He uses it to burn the Jedi Order to the ground from the inside. Using an army you will spend a decade calling brothers. Anakin's expression didn't change, but the durasteel fingers of his right hand, the hand he didn't yet have in this timeline, the hand that wouldn't exist for another 12 years, curled slowly into a fist. You, Q continued, not unkindly, which was somehow worse, become his apprentice. Not because you're weak. Because he spends a decade engineering every circumstance of your life to make sure you have no one left to trust but him, your mother, your wife, your children, who he lets you believe are lost. Every fear he can find, he waters like a garden. He looked, briefly, almost apologetic. I'm told it's a compelling narrative if you enjoy tragedy. I don't, particularly. Too on the nose. And me? Obi-Wan asked, voice level in the specific way that meant it was costing him everything to keep it that way. You lose your best friend to a fire he chooses. Cut down your apprentice on a volcano rather than lose him entirely, and spend the next 19 years alone in a desert babysitting his infant son from a very great distance. It's very noble. It's also, Q added, a spectacular waste of both your lives. In my professional opinion, and I've watched a great many lives get wasted. Qui-Gon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Whatever he had already suspected about his own fate, hearing it delivered in Q's clipped, bored cadence didn't make it easier. Naboo, Q said, turning to Padmé, you'll help save more than once. You'll also die, officially of a broken heart, which even I find a little on the nose for a woman who ran an entire planetary government by 19. Unofficially, someone helps that heart along. His eyes flicked, deliberately, toward Anakin, and let the implication sit. Padmé went very still. And you, Q said to Satine, with something almost like respect, spend your whole life trying to keep Mandalore out of a war it doesn't want. And it very nearly works. Right up until Death Watch and a Sith apprentice named Maul decide. Your pacifism is a problem that needs solving. Personally, Satine's hands, folded so carefully in her lap, tightened until her knuckles paled. Ahsoka, Q said, and for once his voice lost its edge of performance. You get accused of a crime you didn't commit by the same order that raised you from childhood. And when you're finally proven innocent, you walk away from them. Anyway, because by then you've learned exactly how far they'll let an innocent Padawan fall before anyone bothers to catch her. He paused. You're the only one of you who wasn't born yet in the year I've dropped you into, which is, I'll admit, going to make things interesting. The silence on the bridge had the particular density of 6 people trying to hold an entire decade of grief without letting it show. Why are you telling us this? Ahsoka said finally. Instead of just fixing it yourself? You clearly could. Hugh's smile returned, thin and knowing. Because I don't fix things. I show people the board and I watch what they do with it. Omnipotence gets tedious when you use it to solve everyone's homework. He stood, straightening his uniform with theatrical precision. You have 1 year before the Trade Federation blockades Naboo, and the clock you already know starts ticking again. This ship and its crew are yours to use. Until you've either fixed what's broken or made a sufficiently interesting mess trying. I'll be watching either way. And if we fail? Obi-Wan asked. Then you'll have failed twice. Which I imagine stings rather more than failing once. Hugh said, and with a snap of his fingers, was gone, leaving 6 people. A starship that didn't belong in this century. And a year that hadn't happened yet. Standing between them and everything they already knew was coming. The captain's ready room aboard the Enterprise was smaller than the bridge. Quieter and mercifully free of Q's particular brand of cosmic theater. Captain Elena Voss, human, sharp-eyed, the kind of officer who had clearly briefed her crew on temporal directives more than once in her career, offered them seats and did not offer false comfort. He does this, she said. When Obi-Wan asked, carefully, how often Q inserted himself into people's lives this way. Not often, rarely to Starfleet directly. But my orders from command were explicit, full cooperation, non-interference where possible, and considerable latitude to depart from that if the situation demands it. She studied the 6 of them with the frank curiosity of a woman who had spent a career meeting stranger things than time displaced. Jedi, for what it's worth, I don't enjoy being anyone's experiment either. But we're here, and you have a year. I'd rather spend it usefully than resent the ship that dropped us in it. It was Padmé who asked the question none of them had voiced yet. Can we see them? Ourselves, as we are this year. Voss glanced at her first officer, a Vulcan whose expression suggested he had already anticipated the request and prepared several objections to it. Commander Solon can pull planetary sensor feeds. I'd remind you that Q's paradox restrictions apply regardless of what we can technically show you. Show us anyway, Anakin said. It was the first thing he'd said since the bridge. The wall screen resolved into a market square on Tatooine. Twin suns baking sand the color of old bone. Awnings snapping in dry wind. The particular chaos of Mos Espas back alleys. And there, small among the crowd, a boy no older than 9, sun-browned and thin in a way that had nothing to do with a growth spurt and everything to do with rationing, hauling a crate twice his own size toward a junk shop while a Toydarian barked instructions from a doorway. Nobody on the bridge said anything for a long moment. Anakin's throat worked. He had spent 12 years, a lifetime, in the version of events he remembered living, trying not to think about this exact stretch of sand, this exact age, the collar he'd worn, under his tunic that nobody in the Republic had ever bothered to notice, seeing it from the outside, as a man who had since lost a hand, a marriage, and finally his own name to the very fear that slavery had first taught him, was a different kind of pain than memory. Memory, at least, let him pretend distance. That's Watto's shop, he said quietly. He's due back from a supply run in about an hour. Watto sends him alone because it's cheaper than sending an adult. Qui-Gon watched the boy on the screen with an expression Obi-Wan had rarely seen on his old master. Not the serene unreadability of a Jedi at peace with the Force, but something rawer. Guilt, perhaps, for a version of himself who hadn't yet made a promise on a desert world he would, in another timeline, only half keep. I remember buying parts from that shop, Qui-Gon said. In the timeline we came from. I remember a boy who built a pod racer faster than anything else on that planet, and a mother who begged me to take him with me because she knew what waited for him. If I didn't, and you did, Obi-Wan said. Eventually. Eventually wasn't fast enough, Qui-Gon said, and there was no self-pity in it. Only the flat weight of a fact he'd carried through one death already. The screen shifted at Solon's quiet input, a different feed now. Coruscant's upper towers gleaming under artificial dawn. A young woman in ceremonial dress, descending the steps of the royal palace of Theed on Naboo. cheered by a crowd that had no idea what was coming for their planet in less than a year. "That's not me," Padme said softly, watching her own coronation from a bridge that shouldn't exist. "Not yet. She hasn't made a single decision I have. She doesn't know what a blockade costs yet, or a war, or," she stopped herself, "or what it costs to trust the wrong senator," Satine finished, gently, and Padme's eyes closed briefly in something like grief for a version of herself who still believed the Republic's institutions would hold. Ahsoka alone had no image to watch, no younger self anywhere in this galaxy's present, because she hadn't been born into it yet, wouldn't be for several years, wouldn't be found on Shirley and brought to the temple for a decade after that. She stood a little apart from the others, watching them watch themselves, and felt the strange vertigo of being the only person in the room with nothing to lose because she had, technically, nothing here to protect yet. "So what do we do?" she said, cutting through the heavy quiet. "Watch ourselves suffer through a year we already lived once, and call that a plan?" "No," Anakin said, and for the first time since the bridge, something in his voice had hardened into resolve rather than grief. "We stop it. All of it. Starting with him." He nodded toward the screen, toward the boy in the market square who didn't yet know his life was about to be rewritten by strangers who loved him before he'd ever earned it, or before he even existed to them, in the way that mattered. Qui-Gon's hand settled, briefly, on Anakin's shoulder. Carefully, he said, "Hugh's rules exist for a reason, even if he enjoys being cryptic about what it is. We are not gods. We're guests in our own history." "Then let's be careful guests," Anakin said, who still changed the ending. They took a shuttle down, against Captain Voss's carefully worded advice and in favor of Qui-Gon's quieter insistence that some things needed to be seen up close to be understood. Anakin, Obi-Wan, and Qui-Gon went together, cloaked, hooded, the kind of anonymous the Jedi had learned to be on 100 backwater worlds. Padme and Satine stayed aboard with Solon to begin quietly mapping the political currents that would, within the year, curdle into war. Ahsoka went planetside too, mostly because no version of her existed yet for anyone to recognize, which made her, paradoxically, the safest person on the mission. Mos Espa hit exactly as Anakin remembered it. The reek of scorched durasteel and animal dung, the whine of pod engines being tuned in back garages, twin suns pressing down like a physical. Wait, he had spent a decade of his life, in the timeline that no longer technically existed for him, trying to forget exactly how this street smelled. Now he stood in it again, and it smelled like everything he'd never let himself grieve properly the first time. "Stay back from Watto's stall," Obi-Wan murmured, low, close to Anakin's shoulder. "Whatever you're feeling, this isn't the place to feel it." "I know the rules, Master." The old title slipped out before Anakin caught it. Obi-Wan wasn't his master yet. Wouldn't be for another year. And the flicker of surprise on Obi-Wan's face told Anakin he'd noticed the slip too. They were 50 meters from the junk shop when the boy came around the corner, hauling a crate exactly as the sensor feed had shown. Small shoulders straining under a weight built for someone twice his size. Up close, in real air rather than filtered through a view screen, it was worse. Anakin could see the burn scar along the boy's forearm. His forearm. A mark he remembered getting from a coupling failure on a hyperdrive he'd been fixing at age 8. A mark that had, in the other timeline, faded to nothing by the time he was 20. He could see the exhaustion in a 9-year-old's posture that no child should carry. He stopped walking. "Anakin." Qui-Gon's voice, quiet, a warning wrapped in patience. "I'm not going to touch him." The words came out rougher than he intended. He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Every Jedi standing beside him understood exactly what it cost to watch yourself at your most powerless and be forbidden from reaching out. The boy passed within 10 meters of them, close enough that Anakin could hear him humming something tuneless under his breath. The particular cheerful defiance of a child who had decided, against every reasonable evidence, that his life was going to turn out fine. It was a sound Anakin hadn't let himself remember in years. He'd forgotten he used to hum. Then the boy's steps slowed. His head turned, scanning the alley the way a kid raised around junk. Dealers and con artists learned to scan any space, cataloging threats out of instinct rather than thought. His eyes found the three hooded figures standing too still, too watchful, in a street that didn't usually hold strangers who weren't buying or selling something. For half a second, Anakin's own 9-year-old eyes met his own 30-something. Eyes across a gap that should not have existed in any physics anyone in this galaxy understood. The boy frowned, not afraid, just curious. The way children were curious about things adults tried too hard to seem unbothered by, and took one small step toward them. The air around all three of them rippled. It wasn't violent. It was closer to a held breath being released wrong, a pressure that built behind Anakin's eyes and then simply wasn't there anymore. As the boy's curiosity visibly evaporated, his frown smoothing into blank disinterest, his feet already turning back toward Watto's shop as though the last 4 seconds had been erased and quietly filed under nothing worth remembering. Hugh appeared between one blink and the next, arms folded, expression considerably less amused than his usual register. I did mention a rule. He didn't touch anyone, Obi-Wan said tightly. He didn't have to. Direct eye contact at that proximity is close enough to count, and I would very much rather not spend my afternoon unraveling a causality. Not because your former Padawan wanted a moment of catharsis. Hugh's gaze settled on Anakin, and for once there was no theater in it. I understand the impulse. I've watched enough of you to understand it rather well, actually. But if that boy remembers this, really remembers it, not the polite little edit I just performed, he starts asking questions a year early. Questions that reach the wrong ears. Questions that reach him. He didn't need to specify who he meant. Anakin's hands had curled into fists again, this time from something closer to shame than grief. I wasn't going to. You didn't have to intend anything. Wanting is loud enough, where the Force is concerned, and I imagine a certain Sith Lord is rather good at listening for exactly that kind of noise. Hugh's voice softened, marginally, into something almost like advice. You'll get your chance to change his life. Properly. Carefully. Not by standing in an alley aching at him. He vanished as abruptly as he'd arrived, leaving the three of them standing in a street that had already forgotten they existed, watching a boy disappear into a junk shop no wiser about the strangers who'd nearly unraveled his future out of nothing but love. He's right, Qui-Gon said finally, quiet. We came down here to observe. Let's actually do that before we cost him more than we save. Anakin didn't answer, but he turned, finally, and walked back toward the shuttle without looking over his shoulder again. 1,500 light-years away, in a Coruscant apartment high above the permanent haze of speeder traffic, a man who called himself Palpatine set down his stylus and stared at nothing for a long moment. He was, by every outward measure, simply a senator finishing correspondence before a committee session mid-50s. Unremarkable, the kind of face that photographed as trustworthy in exactly the way he had spent 30 years cultivating. Nothing in his posture suggested the centuries of Sith doctrine coiled beneath it. The patience of a man who had planned a galaxy's unmaking one relationship, one manufactured crisis, one quiet betrayal at a time. But he had felt something. It was faint, the force equivalent of a single dropped stone in a lake large, enough to swallow the ripple within seconds. Most beings, even most Jedi, would never have registered it at all. Darth Sidious had spent decades training himself to notice exactly the kind of disturbance that everyone else dismissed as nothing, because nothing was where his enemies always hid before they became something. He closed his eyes and reached, carefully, the way a spider tests, a single strand of web for the specific weight of prey rather than wind. There, Tatooine, faint, already fading, already half erased by whatever had smoothed it over, but real. A flicker of presences that felt, absurdly, familiar. Not one Force signature, but several, tangled together in a configuration his instincts insisted he should recognize and could not quite place. Like a name on the tip of the tongue. He opened his eyes. Whatever it was gone now, scrubbed clean by something with power he could not immediately categorize, which unsettled him more than the anomaly itself. Sidious did not enjoy encountering variables he could not yet name. He rose, crossed to the window, and studied the endless towers of Coruscant with the patience of a predator recalculating a hunt. 13 years, he reminded himself. 13 years of careful work already invested. The Trade Federation cultivated. The Naboo crisis engineered down to its smallest detail. A boy on Tatooine whose midi-chlorian count he had quietly flagged in Republic medical records years ago and filed away for future use. A war already scripted between two armies he alone would command. None of it had shown a single crack in over a decade of execution. And now, 1 year before the blockade he had spent so long assembling, something had rippled across the Force in a configuration he didn't recognize, on the exact planet where his most valuable long-term asset happened to be enslaved. Coincidence was not a concept Sidious extended much faith to. He activated a private comm and waited the several seconds it took to route through 6 layers of obfuscation to a contact he trusted with almost nothing except discretion and violence. "I want information," he said, without preamble, when the channel connected. Tatooine, the Outer Rim territories near Mos Espa. Any unusual arrivals in the last standard? Weak ships, travelers, anomalies in local sensor traffic. I don't care how minor it seems. Report directly to me. Understood, my lord. The voice on the other end did not ask why. That was precisely why Sidious employed it. He closed the channel and stood a while longer at the window, turning the sensation over in his mind with the meticulous unease of a man who had built an empire on the principle that he was always the only one who saw the whole board. If something else could see it too, if something else was already moving pieces he hadn't placed there himself, then the timeline he had spent a decade perfecting had just acquired its first genuine uncertainty. He did not like uncertainty. He had learned across a very long apprenticeship under a master who valued control above all things. That uncertainty was the seed every successful plan eventually died from if left unpruned, which meant, he decided, returning to his desk and drawing a fresh datapad toward him, that whatever had touched the Force near Tatooine would need to be found, understood, and, if it proved a threat to 13 years of patient architecture, removed, quietly, before it had the chance to grow into something that could see him as clearly as he now suspected it might have already begun to. He began drafting a subtly accelerated timetable for the Trade Federation's blockade preparations, moving dates that had been fixed for over a year, and did not for a moment consider that acceleration itself might be the very mistake his unseen watchers were hoping he'd make. Far above Naboo, aboard a ship that did not yet register on any sensor net in the galaxy. None of them felt the shift. Not yet. But the year that had, an hour ago, felt like an unhurried gift had just quietly begun running faster than any of them knew. The debate began the moment the shuttle docked back aboard the Enterprise. And it did not end quickly. "We tell the Council," Obi-Wan said, for what was at least the 3rd time, pacing the width of the briefing room in a way that betrayed more agitation. Then his voice led on. "Yoda deserves to know what's coming. All of it. He spent his life reading the currents of the Force. If anyone can help us prepare the order for what Sidious intends, it's him. And if telling him breaks something we can't fix?" Ahsoka countered, arms crossed. She'd never met Yoda in this timeline, wouldn't, for years yet, but she'd spent a lifetime in the one she remembered, watching the Council's rigid faith in its own wisdom cost people she loved. "You're talking about walking into the Jedi Temple and telling 500 Jedi that the Order dies in 13 years, murdered by their own clone army, and expecting that knowledge not to change everything about how they act between now and then. That's not preparation. That's detonation." "She's not wrong," Satine said quietly, as a former pacifist who'd spent her life negotiating around institutions too certain of their own righteousness. She recognized the shape of the problem instantly. Institutions don't absorb prophecy well, Obi-Wan. They either dismiss it or become obsessed with preventing it. An obsession has its own gravity. It bends decisions in ways you can't always predict. "Then what do you propose?" Obi-Wan stopped pacing. "We simply don't tell them. Let them walk into a war we know is a trap, blind, because we're afraid of how they'll react to a warning. I propose we tell Yoda, not the full Council. Not yet. Qui-Gon's voice cut through the rising tension with the particular calm he'd always used to defuse Obi-Wan's more forceful instincts. Yoda has centuries of judgment behind him. He is capable of holding difficult truths without being consumed by them, more capable, I'd wager, than any of us currently standing in this room. Anakin, who'd said little since Tatooine, finally spoke. And if he decides the right response is to have me watched, tested, removed from Watto's shop early, and shoved into the temple before I'm ready, because a prophecy says I'm dangerous? His jaw tightened. You all remember how that story goes already. Fear didn't start with Sidious manipulating me. It started with an order that looked at a scared kid and saw a threat first and a person second. The room went quiet. It was, Padmé thought, the most honest thing Anakin had said since they'd arrived. Then we set the terms, she said, into the silence. We don't hand Yoda a decade of prophecy and let him do with it whatever fear or duty suggests. We tell him what he needs to prevent the specific catastrophe, a hidden Sith Lord operating inside the Senate, a war engineered to destroy the order from within, a clone army with a kill order buried in its programming. We don't tell him everything about Anakin's future, because that future hasn't happened yet. And Q himself said we're here to write something different, not deliver the same ending with better warning. Qui-Gon inclined his head slightly, approving. A queen's instinct for controlled disclosure. I'd expect nothing less. It's not disclosure, Padmé said. It's triage. We tell him enough to act, and we protect the people, whose futures are still unwritten, from being written for them by fear of what they might become. Obi-Wan studied her for a long moment, then looked to Qui-Gon, then finally to Anakin, really looked at him, the way he hadn't quite let himself since the bridge, weighing the boy this man had once been against the version standing in front of him, now marked by choices that hadn't happened yet in this timeline and might, if they were careful, never happen at all. All right, Obi-Wan said finally. Yoda alone, first. We test the ground before we commit to the whole field. It was arranged through Qui-Gon, using channels and quiet favors from a life he'd once lived and technically no longer had any official claim to a discreet meditation chamber in the lower levels of the temple, accessed after standard hours, no records, no witnesses beyond the one Jedi whose judgment they'd agreed to trust first. Yoda was already seated when they arrived, small and still, eyes closed, as though he'd been waiting considerably longer than the message Qui-Gon had sent could account for. Felt you coming, I did, the old master said, without opening his eyes. Strange, your presence is familiar, and yet not. 6 signatures, tangled with time itself. His eyes opened, settling on each of them in turn, lingering longest on Anakin and then, curiously, on Ahsoka, whose signature in the Force existed nowhere in this timeline's present and should not, by any reasonable law of the galaxy, have registered to him at all. You feel it, Ahsoka said, startled despite herself. Feel what I should not yet be able to feel. Yes. Yoda's ears drew back slightly, thoughtful rather than alarmed. Curious, this is. Explain you will. All of it. And judge afterward, I will. Whether wisdom or danger you carry into my temple tonight. Qui-Gon knelt, bringing himself to something closer to Yoda's eye level, and began, carefully, deliberately, choosing each fact the way Padmé had counseled, to tell the small, ancient Jedi Master exactly enough of the truth to change everything, and not one word more than that. Yoda listened without interruption for nearly 20 minutes, which was, in itself, more unsettling than anything he might have said. His eyes stayed closed through most of it, ears occasionally twitching at specific details, the Senate, the clone army, the phrase, Order 66, but he offered no gasps. No visible horror, only the deep and terrible stillness of someone absorbing a wound he had decided not to let anyone watch him feel. When Qui-Gon finished, the silence in the meditation chamber stretched long enough that Obi-Wan shifted his weight, unable to stand it. Master Yoda. Quiet, I need. Yoda's voice was rougher than usual. His eyes opened at last, and there was something in them Obi-Wan had genuinely never witnessed in the old master before. Fear, carefully governed but entirely real. 900 years. I have served this order. Believed always that see the future clearly enough. We Jedi could, to avoid its worst turns. Wrong I was. blind to the Sith in our midst, blind to the war before it began, blind to the boy. His gaze moved to Anakin, gentle and grieved at once, whose fear we ourselves helped plant. If the tale you tell is true, it's true, Anakin said quietly. I lived it. Orwell would have. A gift this is, and a burden heavier than any I have carried. Yoda was quiet a moment longer. Tell the council, we must not. Not yet. Fear, this knowledge would breed in chambers. Already too quick to fear what they do not understand. A hidden enemy inside the Senate. This, I can act upon, carefully, without revealing its source. A war engineered. This, I can begin to guard against, in ways that raise no alarm. But a boy's fall to darkness, spoken aloud in council chambers? He shook his head slowly. Prophecy become prison, that would. Seen it before, I have, with lesser truths than this one. Padmé's shoulders eased, very slightly, at hearing her own instinct echoed by 9 centuries of Jedi wisdom. There is something else, Qui-Gon said. Something we haven't yet acted on, and need your counsel on before we do. He explained it plainly. The boy on Tatooine, still enslaved, still a year away. From the pod race and the fateful wager that had, in the timeline they remembered, freed him only halfway, freed the boy, but not his mother. A wound that had festered for a decade and helped deliver him, eventually, into Sidious's hands. This time, Anakin said, before Yoda could respond, we don't leave her behind. Whatever else changes. Whatever else you decide about telling the council or protecting the timeline. I am not walking away from that desert a second. Tom with half a family, freed and half a family left in chains. I did that once. It cost more than any of you understand. Yoda studied him for a long moment. Attachment, the old code warns against. And yet, his ears lowered thoughtfully. Perhaps the old code, wrong about some things, was a boy freed but his mother left enslaved. Cruelty, not detachment, that was. Different lessons. This second chance may teach the order, if wisdom enough, we have, to learn them. It was, Obi-Wan realized, the closest thing to doctrinal doubt he had ever heard from Yoda in his life. The mission, Qui-Gon said, would need to be quiet, purchasing 2 slaves outright rather than winning them in a wager risks, drawing exactly the kind of attention Hugh warned us against, and risks alerting whatever hidden agent Sidious may already have watching Tatooine for us. Credits, then, not chance, Padmé said. I can authorize funds through channels that won't trace back to Naboo's throne. My accession isn't for months yet, but I already have access to certain discretionary accounts as a former handmaiden of standing, untraceable, if we're careful. And Watto, Anakin said, something almost like a smile ghosting across his face for the first time since they'd arrived in this timeline. Responds better to a good gambling story than a straightforward sale. Offer him a deal too good to walk away from, and he'll take it without asking too many questions. Satine, who had been quiet through most of the exchange, spoke now with the careful precision of a diplomat weighing costs. And after they're freed, a boy and his mother, suddenly without an owner, without papers, in a system controlled by Hutts, who profit from exactly this kind of arrangement staying in place. Freedom on Tatooine isn't the end of danger. It's often only the beginning of a different kind. Then we don't just free them, Padmé said. We give them somewhere to go. Coruscant has protections for freed persons, thin as they are. Or Naboo, once I'm in a position to extend them formally. She looked to Anakin. This time, it isn't half a rescue. It's a whole one, with somewhere safe on the other side of it. Yoda inclined his head slowly, something that might, in a smaller and less careful being, have been called approval. Wisdom, this plan shows. Careful, still, you must be. Watched, this galaxy now may be. By eyes that should not yet see so far. His gaze sharpened, settling on all 6 of them in turn. Felt something, your Sith Lord may already have. Careless haste, in the coming days, could cost you everything you hoped to save. He was, none of them yet knew, entirely correct. Mandalore, when the shuttle, carrying Satine and a small escort team, touched down in Sindari's domed capital, looked exactly as she remembered it from a year that hadn't happened yet. Clean spires, rising from reclaimed desert, the hard-won architecture of a planet that had rebuilt itself around a promise of peace after generations of war. It was, Satine thought, walking streets she had once nearly died defending. Strange to feel nostalgia for a present she was technically still living in. She had not planned to return home so soon. But the conversation aboard the Enterprise, in the hours after Yoda's counsel, had turned inevitably toward the other lives, adjacent to their own, that Sidious's war would eventually devour, and Mandalore's fall to Death Watch and a Sith apprentice named Maul sat near the top of that list. You want to move against Death Watch a year before it fractures your government, her chief of security said, once she'd briefed her closest advisors, under the thinnest possible cover. Story, a diplomatic consultation. Nothing more. Duchess, with respect, Death Watch barely exists as an organized threat yet. Pre-Vizsla is still consolidating support among the fringe clans. If you act against a movement that hasn't fully formed, you risk creating the very insurgency you're trying to prevent. It was, Satine admitted privately, a fair point, and one that echoed uncomfortably with the paradox rules Hugh had laid out. She hadn't come to arrest anyone, or expose a conspiracy that, in its current form, was still mostly rhetoric and resentment rather than armed rebellion. She'd come for something narrower, and considerably harder to justify to a Security Council that didn't know what she knew. I'm not proposing we move against Death Watch, she said. I'm proposing we address the grievance that lets it grow in the first place. Pacifism without provision breeds contempt among clans who feel abandoned by a government that asks them to disarm and gives them nothing in return. That contempt is Vizsla's entire recruiting pitch. Take it away from him, and Death Watch stays what it is right now, a handful of bitter traditionalists with no army behind them. It was a version of the truth she could defend without ever mentioning a Sith apprentice who, in the future she remembered, would carve his way onto Mandalore's throne with a blade and a broken planet's desperation. Over the following days, working with a council she'd spent years learning to persuade rather than command, Satine began quietly redirecting resources toward the outer clan territories. Infrastructure, medical support, a formal council seat for representatives from regions that had, in her remembered history, felt unheard right up until Death Watch offered them the illusion of being heard through violence instead. It was slow work, unglamorous, the kind of governance that never made a satisfying story, and precisely the kind she suspected might actually hold. It was on the fourth day that Bo-Katan found her. Satine's sister arrived at the palace unannounced, in armor rather than court dress, expression carrying the particular tightness she wore whenever she'd come to argue rather than visit. In the timeline Satine remembered, this was still years before Bo-Katan's break with Death Watch, years before the sisters found their way back to something like understanding, through mutual loss. Here now, Bo-Katan was simply young, frustrated, and already drifting toward Vizsla's orbit in ways Satine had once been too consumed by governance to notice in time. You're spending treasury funds on the outer clans, Bo-Katan said, without preamble, buying loyalty from people who spit on everything you stand for. I'm buying them a reason not to need Vizsla's version of loyalty instead, Satine said. There's a difference, if you're willing to see it. Bo-Katan's jaw tightened. You think credits fix what you broke. When you disarmed an entire warrior culture and called it peace. I think, Satine said, careful, measuring every word the way she hadn't always managed to in the life she remembered, that I made peace look like surrender to people who needed it to look like strength instead. And that was my failure, not theirs. I'm trying to correct it before it costs us both something we can't get back. Something in Bo-Katan's expression flickered, not agreement. Not yet, but the particular uncertainty of someone whose grievance had just been handed less oxygen than she'd expected. I'm not here to fight you, Bo, Satine said, using the old name, the one from childhood, deliberately. I'm here because I don't want to lose you to a man who'll use you as a weapon and call it honor. I've seen where that road ends. I'd very much like this time to end differently. Bo-Katan didn't answer, but she also didn't leave, and for a woman who'd walked in ready to argue, staying was its own kind of answer. Satine allowed herself, for the first time since stepping off Q's impossible ship, the smallest measure of hope that some fractures, caught early enough, might yet be mended before the galaxy found new ways to break them again. The message reached the Enterprise 4 days later, relayed through Solin's censor sweep of Republic and Trade Federation. Communications traffic. The Trade Federation had begun accelerating military logistics toward the Naboo system. Months ahead of the timeline every one of them remembered living through. That's not possible, Padmé said, staring at the data scrolling across the briefing room display. The blockade doesn't happen for nearly a year. In the version we lived, Obi-Wan finished grimly. Something's changed the timetable. Someone, Qui-Gon corrected. Sidious felt something on Tatooine. He's been hunting for its source ever since. If he's found enough to suspect his plans are being watched, accelerating them denies. Whoever's watching the time to prepare a response. He looked around the room. He may not know who we are, but he knows something is wrong. And he's reacting exactly the way a man who's spent 13 years perfecting a plan reacts to uncertainty by removing the variable before it can grow. Ahsoka's montrals twitched. So this is our fault. This is a war he was always going to start, Anakin said. We just made him nervous enough to start it early. On a timetable he hasn't fully wargamed yet. That's not nothing. Captain Voss, who had listened to the exchange with the particular patience of an officer who understood exactly how quickly a temporal mission could unravel into a crisis, folded her arms. Then the question is what we do with an early blockade, instead of the one you were all prepared for. Options. The blockade in our history failed because the Federation didn't expect real resistance until the Queen escaped and rallied the Gungans. Padmé said, this time, Naboo has something it never had before, a queen who isn't yet elected. No Jedi assigned to the negotiation and no plan at all. If the blockade starts now, Naboo falls faster and harder than it did the first time. Unless we change that, Satine said. We can't fight a Trade Federation battle fleet with one Starfleet vessel without exposing exactly the kind of impossible technology Q warned us against. Revealing, Voss said. Federation code prohibits direct large-scale intervention in a pre-warp civilization's internal conflicts. And frankly, even setting policy aside, showing this ship's full capability to a galaxy that isn't ready for it invites its own catastrophe. Then we don't fight the fleet, Obi-Wan said slowly. We do what Naboo needed and never had the first time. We get ahead of the crisis instead of reacting to it. He looked to Qui-Gon. A diplomatic delegation. Official, sanctioned, if we can secure Council backing quickly enough, Jedi presence aboard the lead Federation cruiser before a single shot is fired, forcing negotiation into the light before Sidious's puppet, Newt Gunray, has the chance to act unilaterally. Yoda can authorize that much without revealing why, Qui-Gon said. A diplomatic mission raising concerns about Federation military buildup near a peaceful system is well within ordinary Jedi mandate. No prophecy required. And if Gunray refuses the delegation? Attacks anyway? Ahsoka asked. Then he does it in front of witnesses instead of in the dark, Padmé said. The first time, the galaxy didn't believe Naboo's suffering until a Queen stood in the Senate and demanded a vote of no confidence. This time, we make sure the Republic sees the invasion as it happens, not after the fact. It took 2 days to arrange, 2 days of frantic, careful diplomacy that stretched every relationship Qui-Gon had cultivated across a lifetime he technically no longer owned, and every ounce of Padmé's instinct for building consensus among people who didn't yet know they should trust her. By the time the shuttle carrying Obi-Wan, Qui-Gon, and a formally sanctioned Republic negotiating team approached the lead Federation battleship, the blockade fleet had already begun forming in orbit above Naboo. Early, ragged, visibly unprepared for the scrutiny bearing down on it. Aboard the bridge of the Federation flagship, Viceroy Newt Gunray received the news of an incoming Jedi delegation with the particular panic of a man who had been promised by a hooded holographic master he obeyed without fully understanding that no one would interfere before the invasion was complete. 1,500 light-years away, in his Coruscant office, Darth Sidious received the same news with far less panic and far more interest. Because a Jedi delegation arriving months ahead of any schedule he had engineered meant something, had reached the Republic's ear faster than any information network he controlled should have allowed. He set down his stylus for the second time in a week, and for the second time in 13 years of flawless execution, allowed himself to consider, seriously, that he was no longer the only architect shaping this particular unfolding war. "Send word to Maul," he said quietly, to the empty room. "Tell him to prepare. I believe we have uninvited guests in our galaxy, and I intend to learn precisely who they are before they cost me anything further." The delegation shuttle docked with the Federation flagship under the watchful eyes of droid honor guards who had clearly not been briefed on how to make Jedi feel welcome. Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon walked its corridors with the calm, unreadable patience of men who had spent lifetimes, some of them lifetimes that no longer technically existed, learning to project confidence they didn't entirely feel. Newt Gunray received them in a Durasteel conference chamber with the strained courtesy of a man performing diplomacy for an audience he hadn't chosen. "Jedi Knights," he said, his accent clipped and nervous. "The Trade Federation's presence here is a matter of routine commercial protection. We were not informed of any need for Republic mediation." "Then consider this informing you," Qui-Gon said evenly. "A blockade of a peaceful system, without Senate authorization, is an act the Republic takes very seriously, Viceroy. We're here to ensure this resolves through negotiation rather than force." It was everyone aboard the Enterprise monitoring the exchange knew, a performance on both sides. Gunray stalling for instructions from a master he wouldn't name. Qui-Gon buying time for Naboo's defenses, still hastily organizing under Padmé's guidance, to prepare for a fight that might come regardless of how this conversation ended. It ended badly. Word reached Gunray mid-negotiation, a private, panicked transmission that visibly drained the color from his mottled face, and security droids flooded the chamber within seconds. Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon fought their way clear, lightsabers carving through battle droids in the tight corridors, buying just enough time to signal the Enterprise before Federation jamming swallowed the channel hole. Above Naboo, Captain Voss made the call that would define the battle to come. "We can't fire on that fleet without exposing capabilities this century isn't ready to see," she said, "but nothing says we can't extract our people and disrupt their command structure doing it." She looked to Anakin, seated at a console. He'd spent the last 4 days learning under Solin's patient instruction. "Mr. Skywalker, you wanted a chance to matter. This is it." What followed was not, by any measure, the invasion the galaxy remembered. There was no droid army marching unopposed through Theed streets, because Naboo's forces, warned, prepared, coordinated in ways they'd never managed. The first time met the first landing craft with organized resistance. Instead of confusion, there was no captured queen paraded before a puppet senate, because Padmé, working from the Enterprise's tactical displays with Satine at her side, had spent 4 days building contingencies her younger self on the planet's surface would never have had time to construct alone. And there was, at the heart of it, a Sith apprentice. Maul arrived aboard a stealth ship that evaded even Federation tracking, sent ahead of his master's full plan with a single directive: find the anomaly and remove it. He found Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon first, cornered in a service corridor beneath the flagship's command deck, his double-bladed saber igniting with the same terrible red light Obi-Wan remembered from a hangar bay on Naboo he'd once watched Qui-Gon die in. This time, Qui-Gon did not fight Maul alone. Anakin arrived through a corridor Solon had guided him to via calm, lightsaber drawn, a blade he shouldn't have owned yet in this timeline, built in secret over the preceding days from parts Qui-Gon had quietly supplied. Against every instinct, that told him a 9-year-old boy on Tatooine had no business seeing his older self wielding a weapon he hadn't earned. Yet in this history, 3 against 1 turned the fight from inevitability into genuine contest. Qui-Gon's discipline, Obi-Wan's precision, Anakin's raw, furious skill honed across a war he alone among them remembered fighting to its bitter end. Maul was good. He was not good enough to survive 3 Jedi who had, between them, already died 2 versions of this exact fight and returned, changed by the knowledge of it. When Qui-Gon's blade finally found its mark, the killing stroke that had once been Qui-Gon's own end instead became Maul's. And somewhere 1,500 light-years distant, Darth Sidious felt his apprentice's presence in the Force wink out with a suddenness that told him, more clearly than any report could, that today's plan had failed in ways he had not remotely anticipated. The blockade broke within hours. Without Maul's covert sabotage of Naboo's shield generators, a contingency, Sidious had planned meticulously and Maul had died before executing. Naboo's defenses held long enough for the Federation fleet, leaderless and increasingly desperate, under a viceroy who'd lost contact, with the Master directing him, to withdraw rather than risk annihilation at the hands of a planet that had, against every expectation, been ready for them. It was not a clean victory. Naboo lost people, soldiers, pilots, ordinary citizens caught in a fight that still happened, just not the way history remembered it. Satine mourned 2 Mandalorian volunteers who died aiding the defense, a debt she would carry the rest of her life. Padmé, watching casualty reports, scrolled past on a display aboard a ship from a future she was only beginning to understand, felt for the first time the full weight of a war sheet, once only read about in history's aftermath. But Sidious's plan, 13 years of patient, invisible architecture, had cracked. His apprentice was dead. His timetable was in ruins. And somewhere in the galaxy, a Sith Lord who had never once been forced to improvise was now, for the first time in his adult life, reacting instead of orchestrating. Aboard the Enterprise, 6 people who had arrived a year ago as strangers to their own history stood together on a bridge that didn't belong in this galaxy, watching Naboo's skies clear of Federation ships, and understood that the story they'd once lived through to its tragic end had, for the first time, genuinely diverged. The war wasn't over. Sidious wasn't finished. But the future, for the first time any of them could remember, was no longer written.